Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the literal architecture of global power. When we think about globalization, we usually picture these massive, sprawling networks of trade, or maybe the technology that instantly links all of us together. But the modern world is actually held together by something far more rigid and structured: global institutions. These are the overarching entities that claim to represent and ultimately uphold global order. So today, we're going to crack open the blueprints of these massive structures and see how they actually work.
But before we really break down those blueprints, I want you to hold on to one central question. It's really the core of everything we're going to talk about today. These institutions were built with a very specific goal, right? To stabilize economies, stop catastrophic conflicts, and coordinate cooperation. But we live in a world fundamentally driven by competing interests. So, do these frameworks actually create a harmonious order? Or are they just tools used to manage the endless, inevitable friction between nations?
Here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at designing global order. Then we'll get into coordination versus government, shift over to the balance of power, stress test it all in strengths and limitations, and wrap up with a shifting global order. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Designing global order, crisis and response.
It's really easy to forget that these massive institutions weren't just created in a vacuum. They were a direct, urgent response to total global crisis. Think about the timeline here. The 1930s brought us catastrophic economic collapse and deep instability, which bled right into the pure devastation of a global war in the 1940s. The modern frameworks we know today, they were born straight out of that trauma from 1945 onward.
At their core, they were engineered with one beautifully simple principle: prevent global chaos through deliberate coordination. And that definition is absolutely crucial. When nations interact, conflicts of interest aren't just a possibility, they are a 100% certainty. It's just the reality of geopolitics. These global institutions basically provide the room where those frictions can be managed, whether that's through diplomacy, high-level finance, or development.
All right, moving on to Section 2, coordination, not government, voluntary agreements.
We've got to clear up a massive misconception right out of the gate, this myth of some omnipotent global government dictating all the rules. It's just not how it works. The reality is vastly different. These are purely coordination frameworks. They operate strictly through voluntary agreements between member states. There's no global police force, no direct enforcement power. Their entire authority relies exclusively on participation. If nations decide not to play ball, the institution literally has zero power. Nada.
Which brings us to the big three, where each one has a super specialized role in this whole architecture. You've got the United Nations taking point on diplomacy and peace coordination. Then, flipping over to the financial side, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, steps in for financial stability and crisis support when economies hit the fan. And finally, the World Bank tackles long-term development financing. They're all holding a completely different piece of the puzzle, coordinating rather than commanding.
Okay, Section 3. The balance of power, weighted influence. Now let's look at how decision-making power actually shakes out. Standard membership might get a nation a tiny seat at the table, sure, but actual influence? That heavy hitter status is strongly tied to a nation's economic strength, their financial contributions, and their geopolitical weight. It is definitely not a one-country, one-vote utopia.
What we're observing is a fully designed structural imbalance. The nations holding the most capital simply exert the most influence, plain and simple. Because these historical voting systems favor the biggest financial contributors, the playing field isn't exactly level. The whole architecture was built so that certain nations will inevitably shape global outcomes way more than others.
And you can really see this leverage play out in the real world when you look at financial arms like the IMF and World Bank. On one hand, their loans provide absolutely vital, lifeline stability for countries in crisis. But on the flip side, that support almost always comes with strings attached. We're talking strict conditions that create long-term obligations and demand massive structural reforms. Basically, to get the cash, borrowing nations often have to let these international institutions directly shape their own domestic policies. It's a huge trade-off.
Let's put this system to the test. Section 4, strengths and limitations, a stress test.
Now, despite those structural imbalances and all the valid criticisms they face, we can't ignore the fact that these institutions do some incredibly heavy lifting. When disaster strikes, these are the exact frameworks we rely on for humanitarian coordination, conflict mediation, global health rollouts, and rapid disaster response. In a massive crisis, coordination is everything. Without these structures in place, our global response to something like a pandemic or a major natural disaster would be dangerously slow and totally fragmented. They provide the necessary scaffolding for collective human action.
But, and it's a big but, they reflect the competing interests of all their member states. And that leads to some major structural limitations. Because they require consensus among nations that often literally can't stand each other, decision-making can be agonizingly slow. They get completely bogged down in political gridlock. Throw in that unequal global influence we just talked about, plus strict limits on actual enforcement, and you end up with institutions that seriously struggle to adapt quickly when the world really needs them to.
If you take away just one thing today, let it be this exact phrase. Coordination does not always equal effectiveness. It perfectly nails that tension between what these institutions want to do and what they can actually pull off in the real world. Just because you shove all the world's nations into one room doesn't mean they're magically going to agree on a fix. These aren't neutral spaces. They are active arenas where states are constantly fighting for their own interests.
Which brings us to our final act, Section 5, a shifting global order, the future of power.
We are right in the middle of a massive transition toward multipolarity. Power just isn't anchored to a single global center anymore. We're moving fast away from that post-war world where everything was highly concentrated in traditional Western hubs. With global trade routes expanding like crazy, we're seeing the rapid emergence of incredibly diverse, powerful economic and political blocs outside the West. It is a whole new ballgame.
The reality we're facing, these legacy institutions, which, let's be honest, often move at a tortoise's pace, are getting totally outpaced by the rapid economic forces they were originally built to manage. Power is shifting under our feet. The global system is evolving way faster than the boardrooms in New York or Washington can keep up with. As we've seen throughout this explainer, global order has never been about absolute control. It's maintained entirely through cooperation. But what happens when the players sitting at the table suddenly have vastly different levels of power than they did back in 1945?
So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. As the whole architecture of power shifts, will our current global blueprint survive, or are we about to witness a complete ground-up redesign? These frameworks were built to create order in a divided world, but they're being bent by the very forces they're trying to manage. The question isn't really if they'll exist, but how much control they'll actually hold in a world where the balance of power is entirely flipped. Thanks for tuning into this explainer.